The Drake Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating public and professionals in our business with fact-based information, featuring the experts in our profession, so that we all might do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes and the athletics administrators who are managing these programs. So we welcome you to our 41st webinar. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their time, expertise, and ideas, and to all of you for attending. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on the issues, and get up to date on important topics. So we're pleased to have you join us. Before you meet our panelists and moderator, I would just want to emphasize that our speakers are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or are members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. And I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Welch Suggs, Associate Director, Carmichael Sports Media Institute at the University of Georgia.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here, and I'm particularly honored to be working with the Drake Group after pestering its members about big pictures athletics and all the years I spent as a reporter. Let's go ahead and get started. When you registered for the webinar, you got the biographies for our panelists, but let me thank them and acknowledge each one of them before I begin asking questions. Joey Lynn Caternicchio is a Nordic ski coach and former manager for the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Association, and she was a skier at St. Lawrence University and the University of Alaska at Anchorage. Russell Dinkins is executive director of the Tracksmith Foundation and an athlete for the New York Athletic Club and ran track at Princeton University. Meg Hancock is a professor of sport management and leadership at the University of Louisville and was a basketball player at Randolph-Macon Women's College, as you can see right above her right shoulder. Dion Kohler is director for the Center for Sport and the Law at the University of Baltimore and went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst as a gymnast. Dave Redpath is one of the first Drake Group members I have met way back in the early 2000s and is a professor of sport management at Ohio University. He was a sports reporter for the school paper at Colorado State, but also wrestled while he was in the Army. I am going to start out with questions for our panelists to frame this conversation, but as Becca mentioned up top, please chime in with your own questions in the Q&A. I've got the chat open right now, so I will weave in questions sort of as they're relevant to the conversation and then also open it up as we move forward. But back in April, I took students to the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee Media Summit in New York City, and a reporter asked Sarah Hirschland, who is the CEO of the USOPC, if she'd been paying attention essentially to the changes that had come in college sports. She said yes, it was something they were monitoring closely. College athletics plays a critical role, she said, not only in developing Team USA's roster, but also for countries around the world, many of whom send their fastest and brightest to compete at American colleges and universities. As we all know, athletes in Olympic sports train just as hard, if not harder, than the athletes we see on TV week in and week out, and that's an important pipeline to development. The problem is that anyone who has spent time around athletic administrators knows that the term Olympic sports is also kind of a synonym for non-revenue sports. The sports we love may bring tuition-paying students to colleges, but they don't attract a lot of spectators or TV revenue. So the massive changes that we have seen in Division I sports, such as NIL, conference realignment, pay-for-play models that are coming, they're all being driven by football and men's basketball. And gymnastics, skiing, track, other sports are kind of being dragged along for the ride, or they're being kicked out of the car entirely. I saw just this week that Campbell University apparently is cutting back on funding for wrestling, despite having a very prominent program in North Carolina. So this webinar is designed to explore what the changing landscape of college sports means for the rich history of broad-based athletic programs across the country. We know these sports, we love these sports, and I think it's fair to say that we're worried about what the future might hold for them. But I want to turn first to Dion and Dave for some big picture perspective. From the 35,000-foot view, what makes American college sports unique in the role it plays in developing Olympic athletes? Dave, let's start with you.
Thanks, Welch, and it's great to be here. And, really simply put, I mean, the United States, we are the only country in the world that has a significant portion of our elite athletic development grounded in the education system. And while on the surface, and again, I don't argue that there hasn't been numerous positives from that relationship, the bottom line is no matter what level, regardless of the sport that you're involved in, and anxious to hear what Russell and Meg and others have to say on this, but typically coaches are hired and fired based upon winning. The athletes, their main goal is to be a successful athlete, where the academics takes a back seat and sometimes takes such a back seat that we see outright academic fraud. We see clustering in different majors, things that the Drake Group has been talking about for many, many years. Um, the issue with that is the system that primarily develops athletes, obviously, for our national and Olympic teams. And with that being the case, it's our primary pipeline, and it's one that is right now pretty fragile. If indeed we think college athletics and maybe to a lesser extent scholastic athletics may go down the path that really we have seen happen the past 2 or 3 decades of many sports being eliminated, opportunities in some sports being contracted, and that can have an effect on, I believe, and I think certainly the data is showing at least some reduction in our ability to succeed at the Olympic level or the international level. And so my main research area is looking at potential alternative models that the United States can adopt in whole or in part to have elite development pathways outside of the educational system. We can still have sports within the educational system. It just shouldn't be our main sport development pathway. And I think we're starting to see some of the erosion and issues by keeping it this way, and the way that college athletics is going. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. We need to seriously look at other sport development pathways in America.
Yeah, and I know you worked on a commission that looked at the impact of the developmental pathway through college, as Dave is saying. From his standpoint, do you feel like this is a healthy model, that this is working? What were the findings of your commission, and what are the key challenges that you all identified?
So thanks for that, Welch. The college sports model was not a charge that Congress, studying that was not a charge that Congress gave to our commission. However, there was no way for our commission to ignore the intersection of college sports, because college sports programs supply 75 to 80% of our Olympians and about 30% of our Paralympians. And so it is very, very important to our pipeline. And so we identified many, many issues with our Olympic sports system. But one of the things that I think it all boils down to, and this was a key recommendation that we made in the report, is that we rely very heavily on the college sports system to deliver Olympic and Paralympic athletes, because way back in the 1970s, we made a policy choice. Congress did with the Amateur Sports Act, now the Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, to have no government funding for our Olympic teams, no government support. And at that time, this was sort of a Cold War counterpoint to what the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries were doing with government-supported athletes. But the reality is, well, we know, and our commission did public surveys on this, the United States public wants successful Olympic and Paralympic teams. We want that. It's in our national interest. There are a variety of reasons why we want it. And the public is certainly in favor of paying for that, of having sources of public support and federal dedicated revenue. We don't have it right now, and so we're offloading those costs onto colleges and universities. So I think that we need to reimagine a policy solution for the sports system we have today and stop trying to run a sports system that was designed in the 1970s.
That's a great point, and there's a couple things I want to come back to. I do want to remind our attendees that you need to put your names on your questions. We do not want to take anonymous questions per se. So please bear that in mind when you're putting discussion or putting items in the Q&A. Meg, to pick up on that point about sort of how most other countries have public funding models for their Olympic sport development. So we obviously the government controlling things, it's say China or I know Team GB uses lottery revenue to support athletes in that way. Do you think that our system adds up to an overall advantage or disadvantage compared to competing against these other countries with state-funded systems?
So it's a great question, Welch. And again, I want to say thank you for having me here today. I see a number of colleagues and students in the room, so I appreciate them being here as well. Let me first really quickly talk about the disadvantages of college sport relative to state-funded programs. And I'm just going to hit on 2 points here. And one is certainly a lack of centralized control, right? Where state-funded systems have centralized coaching and athlete development programs with a single national goal, where there is funding toward developing particular talent pipeline streams for optimal performance in those sports. And so because we have over 1,000 colleges and universities, and when we think about the level of Division I athletics, Division II athletics, and the hundreds of millions of dollars that are infused within that, we still recognize that they're dispersed across the country in that way, and that funding structures are different within conferences as well as athletic departments that also have to be accounted for. There's also limited funding for certain sports. So obviously, as we've discussed, and I know that we'll discuss in a little bit, the collegiate sports structure really prioritizes those revenue generating sports like football, like basketball, and sometimes that can come, I'm not even going to say sometimes, that comes at the expense of our Olympic sports. And so this can also reduce the resources that are available for athletes in those sports, and in those sports where the U.S. traditionally competes in the Olympic Games. When we think about the advantages, we're really thinking about how we're developing a really large talent pool and pathway. So when we think about the full pathway, the millions of young people that participate in interscholastic sport and how that funnels up through the collegiate level to hundreds of thousands to our hundreds of elite athletes, I think it's important to recognize that not only does the talent pool attract, right, great Olympic athletes in the forms of track and swimming and gymnastics and skiing in our winter sports, but recognizing that the college landscape for those athletes that are participating in certain sports can also train them for other sports. So for example, at one institution that I worked at, we had a field hockey player who actually competed in rugby at the Olympic level, but it was because they had access to the resources in a collegiate sport environment, which also connects to the resource abundance, right? When we think about the athletic departments, not just the physical opportunities that they provide athletes in terms of training, elite coaching, and I mean that from the head coaches themselves to our mental performance staff to strength and conditioning staff, sports science, medical folks that are there concentrated for the success of those athletes. And also certainly the diversity of sports, but the educational experience. So thinking about how the college landscape can ideally certainly train these elite athletes, but from the educational experience, give them an opportunity to build skills beyond their sport that will help them in the future. So in my opinion, I would certainly say it's advantageous. Our system is advantageous, but we certainly have to recognize that we are at an interesting tension point for us based on many of the comments that have already been made.
Absolutely. Russell, we have a question here from a George Gross saying, what is there to stop universities from dropping Olympic varsity sports down to club status? And I think one answer to that question might be Russell Dinkins. So can you tell us a little bit about the arguments that you've made, the dialogue that you've had with universities about maintaining sports at a varsity level?
Thank you for that intro, and thank you, Judge Gross, for the question. Just to give the audience a little bit of background on the work that I did in 2020 and in 2021, I helped save 4 track and field programs from elimination, specifically arguing around the racial and social economic opportunities that track and field provides. Track and field is a very, very accessible sport. It enjoys large participation at the high school level. It's the largest sport when you include male and female participation. And it's the cheapest sport at the youth level. So by eliminating track and field, they were cutting, broad-based pathways that are accessible to a lot of different communities. At the time, we were able to leverage kind of racial and socioeconomic arguments in order to save track and field. And those were successful given the time period, given where we were as a society. Things are a little bit different now. I do think that the Olympic sports movement overall can do a few things to kind of bolster their arguments. One thing that I think could be done. Now, this would require some advocacy for a change in reporting, but there's something called the EADA, which is the Equity and Athletics Data. It is federally required. Universities that receive Title IV funding that also have intercollegiate programs have to report their data to the federal government. In that reporting, you list how many people participate in each sport, and then also your revenue and expenses. But not captured in that data are the tuition dollars that these programs bring to a university. And if the tuition dollars were included, we may see a different picture in terms of the actual real cost to a university. And at times, these programs may actually show themselves to be a tuition benefit or, a financial benefit to the university, or at the very least, that the financial burden to these universities may be far less than what it may seem when you're just looking at operating expenses and ticket sales in terms of revenue. And so I think that's one way that the Olympic sport movement in colleges can try to give themselves better footing in terms of arguments. Hey, we're actually not costing these universities as much as it may seem. I think, changing the way that things are reported on the EADA could be helpful in that regard. And then I also think there are some more cultural kind of arguments that can be made. If we look at football, for instance, outside of Power 5, or I guess Power 4 now, conferences, Pac-12, when you look at football programs, for instance, and I have nothing against football. This is not to besmirch those programs, but most football programs outside of Power 5, Power 4 institutions do not make money for the universities. They actually are a significant resource drain, and yet those programs seldom are cut or eliminated due to financial concerns because there's a cultural importance that football plays. And I think that if the Olympic sport movement can position itself as being culturally important, not only to the US's Olympic efforts, but also to the communities in which these universities exist, I think that could also be something that can help to save these programs from being eliminated or moved down to a club status where they will have less of an impact. I think about the fact that we have these football programs that exist and they're really important. Universities, could regard athletics as being a benefit in the way that they regard their arts programs as being a benefit. No one is asking arts programs to pay for themselves. No one is talking about the ticket sales that these arts programs have. It's often regarded that arts programs at universities make for a complete, holistic, liberal arts educational experience. And I think that, if we're able to get the public writ large to also view athletics as being one part of many that creates a holistic, co-curricular educational experience, perhaps that can also give Olympic sports a little bit of, protection as universities are looking at ways to curtail offerings, and in light of, payments to athletes and things of that nature, there's going to have to be financial and also cultural arguments, I believe, that are going to convince universities to keep these programs, and at least in the short term. I think if we were able to move to having more state-sponsored or federally sponsored kind of programs outside of the collegiate space, I think that would be awesome. I think at least at this juncture, we don't have the setup for that. I don't have a high degree of confidence that we would be able to get something like that through Congress, right now. And so I think trying to protect what already exists in the collegiate space might be the best thing to do in the short and immediate term, the short and in the intermediate term. And, if things need to exist outside the collegiate space, in the long term, I think that may be a more long-term, longitudinal goal. But I think, at least for right now, I just don't want to see these opportunities taken away from, kids who could benefit, right now, people who are in high school, people who are in middle school, who will soon be entering the collegiate ranks.
Absolutely. And I love that notion of cultural relevance. And I think we all know universities, are mostly trying to chase down prestige. And I think if we could tie that pursuit of prestige into sort of the cultural relevance and rich history of sports like track, like volleyball, like others, that there's some really interesting things to talk about there. But just in terms of setting the table, Joey, I wanted to turn to you. I will confess I have not seen snow in Georgia in like 10 years, so this is a realm that I'm really unfamiliar with. So can you tell us, just at a background level, what role colleges play in Olympic athlete development in a sport like Nordic skiing?
Absolutely. I think we can it'll be a fun thing to add here because we've talked about government funding, as I'm hearing on here, moving to that model. What does colleges play and can the government help? And I'm actually representing a sport that is so government run in any sort of competition. So where swimming and track and fields soil houses our Olympic basically development model. If you look at the Summer Olympics, we had 1,200 collegiate athletes attending the Paris Olympics, 125 countries, and 251 universities were represented, and 385 of those were Americans. So the Europeans are using our soil as well for development. When you look at Nordic skiing, we've tried it all, and this might make some answers. There's not a lot of funding out there for government house. We go directly against countries like Norway, big oil countries, and we have the US Ski and Snowboard. They do a great, successful job. When you look at some of it, it's much like collegiate athletes, where Alpine can garner a lot of sponsorships. Something like Nordic may not be able to. It is the exact same landscape as the colleges. So before we start ditching the college pathways, I would recommend that we partner with them. And I'll give you an example. We tried to do a centralized Nordic ski pathway in the 2000s, where we encouraged young athletes to just come central and not go to college, and potentially because we had to be on European soil to be competing. And to be honest, that model did not work. What works is a collaboration model, because we're forgetting in the United States, we all peak out at different ages in our sports. Some is 20, some could be 30. I happen to be working in a sport that's a little bit longer for your peak for your age. But what's the most important thing in the United States is eventually a job. And how do you get a job that's college? To forego any sort of academic progress along your ages and your 20, you're postponing your life. And so in the United States, our culture is much different. I'm not I don't actually have all the statistics of European athletes and any sort of job role or educational role, but our model in the United States cannot mimic what happens in Europe. And we can actually show you that with Nordic. So what we did in the late 2000s is we did a collaboration, and we actually encouraged the collegiate system, and we started partnering with them more. So it wasn't isolated and it wasn't two pathways. And actually our success has grown. So partnering with our resources, which is our local clubs, our universities, and our national program, has been way more successful than either going away from college altogether, because we showed that that didn't work. So I guess we're in the super rare thing. We look at Division 1, 2, and 3. Division 3 is the original amateur model that's starting to bring. Why do students attend universities? Why do colleges want students and athletes, right? Well, first and foremost, I heard it's for athletic prowess, and yes, it is. But I think all of you guys on here, including most athletes, want also a high rating education, so that when their collegiate athletic model might end, what are they going to do next, right? Football, we are a football state. We need to isolate football out of the college athletic dynamics so that we can continue what Russell just said, the amateur style of a college athlete, the holistic. That athlete brings in, and we did notice this in Nordic, it brings in a community of activists, alumni in the future, your doctors, your lawyers, your teachers, your coaches. And when we forego that and just look at a national system of what maybe the Europeans are doing, we are going to lose that sense of community of what the United States is about. So no matter what model we do, it has to be individual for the US. And we've noticed when swimming, we look at some of our elite gold medalists are attending our universities and using our coaches and vice versa. The skiing model basically came back to a hybrid model. And looking forward and having kind of been there where we tried to exit the collegiate model, cost doesn't matter. It is still just as hard to support these sports unless you're a high TV viewer like Alpine or football. You're going to have the exact same issues.
Absolutely. Joey, could you give a quick example of, kind of what a modern career path for a Nordic skier might be?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with our Nordic skiing, with swimming, you used to peak out at age 18, and in Nordic skiing, you used to start at age 18. Now we're noticing that in our collegiate athletics, our timelines of ages are going longer. On average, where we used to peak in our Nordic endurance sports, much like a marathoner, you would show in your late 20s. So you would be using the college pathway for success, not to just jump to the Olympics, but for training venue to finish your education for a lot of athletic opportunities. So the pipeline of a pathway of a Nordic skier is to excel at a young age, but continue to actually excel through college, join either the US ski team, or what we have is post-collegiate programs that are super starting to become robust, which then carries that 21 through 26 to 28-year-old on. In the 2000s, we didn't have those robust collegiate programs, post-collegiate programs. So those have partnered and then bringing the colleges. So it's a stepping stone to go in. And then there's always an offshoot when you have a national governing body team. You are working with that collegiate athlete schedule, plucking them through, doing national sports, plucking them back in, because we're a sport that the NCAA championship isn't our national sport. A national sport would be World Juniors in Europe, or perhaps a national event. So again, these are different types of sports, but does the college matter for a Nordic sport that does do a lot of, governmental type support or national support? Absolutely. We would not have the athletes without allowing them to attend the universities, without the Nordic collegiate program. And so it's a kind of an outlier model. It's a small sport, but it may be worth studying before we decide college athletics should not be, based in the US. We should go to government institutions only. We should look at those models. Funding's hard no matter what. So.
Always. Let me throw this open to everyone just in terms of the current issues that are impacting college sports. In the past 3 years or so, how has NIL changed the sport or sports you're most familiar with? For the audience, let me clarify that allowing college athletes to market their names, images, and likenesses has had a lot of interesting consequences and unforeseen ones. But I think it would be fair to say that a handful of athletes in Olympic sports have made some really significant endorsement deals with brands, but they're not getting the big payments from boosters like Power 4 football players to come to university or stay at university. For any of y'all that want to pick this up, does that sound like a fair description of the sports you're interested in? Dave, we can go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and start out. I mean, obviously, I've been a big supporter, publicly of college athletes being able to capitalize off their name, image, and likeness. And I think, after 3 years, we still have to have some leveling off. We're looking at even some women's sports are becoming much, much more popular, and the ability of female athletes to earn significant NIL income has been fantastic. I think we can make a fair argument that it's even helped out parity in a sense, that you have seen some athletes, Travis Hunter, when he went to Jackson State, being the top football recruit when Deion Sanders was there, because of, sort of the availability of NIL money. The one thing I always say is that honestly, it's not much different. This, Welch. These things were going on behind the scenes. Jimbo Fisher said it best. NIL has always been around. We just didn't talk about it before. Now we're seeing, what has manifested itself over decades in college sports and recruiting is that college athletes have value. They all have value. Some have more, some have less. And obviously, there's going to be some that don't get that much, but they should have access to getting whatever that may be. Even the backup punter, at Ohio State has value back in his hometown, or a female athlete who's at a big school may not be starting, but has value in their hometown. So I think in the end, and the panelists are free to disagree, is that, I think the changes have been positive. One, because we're giving a right that never should have been taken away to college athletes that all college students have. And in the end, we're really seeing about the same. The same football teams are still the best. The same basketball teams are still the best. We're not seeing really a change in that. And competitive equity is to me not an issue, because it's not haves and have-nots. It's haves and never will be's. And I've advocated for schools to play at a level they can afford and sustain, like my own institution. Ohio University will never be Ohio State athletically. Even if somebody wrote us $100 million check today, we would still be $100 million behind. And how would we get the $100 million the next year? So I think NIL has been a great thing. It's just something that we're seeing that has been happening for well over 50, 60 years, and it's more fair to the athletes.
Other thoughts from you all? Just go ahead.
Go ahead, Joey.
Well, I would agree. I think adding in the professionalism of NIL has been needed and is important. What I think we're going to potentially lose, though, is these colleges are fighting to now use that for winning and competition, right? Whether they're using their own budgets to pay for those athletes. The athletes going out marketing, we had this in Olympic blackout dates where because of media, the athletes weren't allowed to sell themselves on social media in certain times. So not only is it collegiate rules, there was Olympic rules. We've known that to be softening up recently is, athletes can now be marketing themselves on their Facebook, their Insta, which is adding. So all movements and athletic movements need to give those rights back to those athletes. And I 100% agree. What I disagree, though, is that the colleges are, as Russell and I have been fighting, cutting sports to save money for their university so that they can put it into high-level athletes like basketball and football. I would like to see NCAA create some restrictions saying you can funnel money towards these athletes, but you can't cut these sports to do it. And that's exactly what's happening. So while I believe NIL for the athlete is absolutely key, I believe the universities and all of the brokers that are starting to evolve to manage this money or solicit money or have some sort of piece of this puzzle is going to be detrimental.
Yeah, let me turn to you next with this. And is it feasible legally for, some kind of, federal regulation or law to say, essentially what Joey is arguing, that you cannot, cut sports to, fund more money or funnel more money into football and men's basketball?
Yeah, so Welch, I think that's a really important question to ask. And first of all, I want to clarify some things just for folks who are listening. So because I think there can be some confusion here. For instance, when I'm talking about the commission report and I say the commission recommended increased government funding, know that government funding does not mean government control. There are certainly government control systems, and you could set up a government sports system like China, say. That's not what the commission recommended, and I don't think anybody's really talking about that. So the types of things that Joey's talking about in terms of collaboration are government funding could be providing funding to colleges and universities. Now, as far as whether Congress or states, whether we could regulate in this area, I say emphatically, yes, we can. We have too little amount of law in sports for as important as sports are at all levels in our country. And what's happened, I think, is that we're in this situation because of really kind of three different assumptions that we make every day. And it's just sort of inherent in our background. And we put ourselves in these boxes and we don't think outside of them. And then the number one assumption that we make around this is that Congress and state legislatures should defer to sports regulators to solve these problems. And that's nonsense. Congress has ample authority, constitutional power under the Commerce Clause, under the spending power to absolutely regulate and set agendas for intercollegiate athletics. It has not done so. And state legislatures, we saw with NIL, finally woke up and realized there is ample authority. There is so much legal authority to use that we're not using. And so I think we need to get ourselves out of these thought patterns that say we have to wait for the NCAA to do something. The NCAA is a private membership association. They don't regulate. They regulate internally, but they should be regulated at this point now. I think there's a very good argument. And when we regulate, again, Welch, it doesn't mean government takeover of sports. It means setting policy agendas and really doing the types of weighing and balancing of interests that need to be done. As far as the initial question that you posed about NIL and what we're seeing with NIL, I just want to note that back in 2020, I testified in one of the first hearings on NIL. There was lots of concern about this. And the NCAA had a steady drumbeat going that NIL will destroy college sports. I've actually published on this, Welch. If you go back in time, remember Title IX was going to destroy college sports. There would be no more college football because of Title IX. I've documented the NCAA's many invocations of the sky is falling argument. It never falls. And so here we are 4 years later, NIL has not destroyed college sports. And so I do hope we take some of these arguments with a grain of salt.
Absolutely. And you brought up Title IX. We have a couple of questions in the chat, including one from Arthur Bryant, who knows more about this than all of us because he's been fighting litigating Title IX in court going back into the 1980s. And he asked basically, Title IX, the most powerful weapon we have to prevent the elimination and demotion of women's, in some cases men's sports, is Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination by colleges and universities that get federal funds. So why are advocates why aren't advocates making greater use of it? And what can we do to educate athletes to use Title IX to fight for equal treatment and preserve their teams? Russell, let's start with you and then have everyone else chime in.
Great, thanks. Arthur and I know each other pretty well. He was the counsel that we retained when I was working to help save Clemson's men's track and field program. What ended up happening, the men's team was saved, and then Clemson also through the settlement agreed to add 2 additional women's programs because we found that Clemson was violating Title IX on behalf of men, but also in terms of unequal treatment towards women in terms of athletically related aid and also some recruitment expenses and other forms of mistreatment. And so what actually ended up saving the men's program was the first time a men's program was saved on the basis of the proportionality prong of Title IX was due to a collaboration between the men's team and the women's team. The women's team was able to use the discrimination that they were experiencing in order to kind of leverage that to get a settlement from the university. And so it was a really brilliant kind of strategy that utilized grievances that were occurring to both teams in order to ensure that the men's program stayed, and kind of a unintended but awesome consequence was that the university agreed to add more opportunity for women through the creation of 2 additional programs. And so that is one way that we have found success. And I do think that there probably should be more education around how Title IX can be used, how the different prongs can be used in terms of proportionality, in terms of equal treatment. One thing that I actually did reach out to Arthur about is I wanted to make sure I got clear on certain things where some of the potential changes we're going to be seeing. Now with these new settlements, we're going to be seeing colleges, probably pretty soon, paying athletes directly. Name, image, and likeness was kind of more of an indirect pathway. But now we're going to be seeing colleges, paying athletes potentially directly. And I have the number here. I think it was 2.8 billion, in back pay from 2016. The lion's share of which may be going to football athletes and men's basketball athletes. And so there are some very real Title IX implications in terms of how the monies will be doled out. I'm of the thought that, I didn't do improv, but I think there's a great standard at improv, yes, and I think, yes, these athletes need to get their worth. There are billion-dollar television contracts that were negotiated on behalf of these basketball athletes that they did not see, their share of. They deserve their share. They deserve to be, paid. The NCAA created student athlete back in the 70s as a way to protect themselves from liability. We need to ensure that, that these athletes get what they deserve. Also, we also need to ensure that women are treated equitably. And so I do think that, that is going to be a challenge, but I do think that we need to ensure that as these monies start to get doled out, that we do ensure that women are also included in the process, that they also are treated fairly, while ensuring that these athletes who have been, creating a lot of money for other people are also able to get their due slice of the pie.
Meg, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. One, I want to say, Dion, I really I love history and those history lessons. And I think that's really important to this argument here, is understanding, why we are where we are. And I think a lot of the conversation around Title IX has been, it can be a burden to institutions, when the truth is it has been a liberator and an innovator. It has caused us to think in new and different ways about how we can create access and opportunity, or how we should create access and opportunity. And I think those are some things that we really need to jump on when we're thinking about the role that Title IX plays. Is this is an opportunity, this is an opportunity to create innovation, to allow athletic departments, to allow athletes to begin to explore new avenues for, budget restructuring, policy development. And I love what Russell brought up in terms of helping teams, our men's and women's teams, our co-ed teams, recognize and understand the power that they have in liberating each other in this space too. I'm a huge proponent of NIL. I think where we've gotten into trouble when it comes to the competitive aspect, and I know this is not necessarily a topic for the day, I think that's the transfer portal. And we can kind of hold off on that, because I think it's allowed for some shifting around, and certainly for athletes to see what their value is in many cases. The only thing that I want to say about NIL is that we have seen, particularly football, men's basketball, some women's basketball, some women's gymnasts have great success with that. But I don't think that is the experience of the majority of our athletes. And as a result of that, while they want to seek NIL opportunities, some of the conversations I've had with athletes are, well, they're just not interested in me as a field hockey player, or in me as a swimmer. And so they've chosen not to put their time and energy into pursuing those deals. But I think a lot of it falls to educating those athletes and providing support for those athletes on how they might pursue those opportunities if they want to, because they are high-level elite athletes that have an opportunity and a platform to earn for themselves, but also be role models for a lot of other young people coming through the system. And so those are just some things that I think we should think about, is how can we use Title IX as an innovative opportunity, rather than institutions thinking about it as a burden of compliance, and getting our athletes to really think about how they can leverage each other. And using Russell's example about the men's and women's teams at Clemson, to elevate them, because when one team is elevated, we ideally see them all elevate in that space.
Absolutely. I hope that's the case. I would say that the Power Four athletic administrators, or athletic policymakers, are not necessarily the most innovative bunch. And so I think finding space for that is going to be the biggest challenge there.
There.
But a couple of y'all have alluded to this, but I want to talk about kind of the big looming paradigm shift. So I'm going to go all Taylor Swift on y'all, and I apologize for that. But right now we're in the NIL era of college sports, where that is sort of the model for the economic relationship between boosters, fans, colleges, and athletes. So before that was the amateur era, or you might call it the bagman era, in which some players got payments under the table, but no one got overt money beyond scholarships. So the next era to drop might be called the pay for play era. So colleges are going to be sharing television revenue and providing other payments to athletes, at least those in the revenue sports, thanks to a settlement that's gotten preliminary approval, primarily in the House case, but there's also another couple of cases involved in that. There's a lot of moving pieces, including the $2.8 billion number that people have been throwing around in terms of providing back NIL payments. But in terms of athletes who are moving forward, Dion, I wonder if you could set the table and explain sort of what the key parts of the settlement of this case are likely to do for today's and tomorrow's athletes as opposed to yesterday's.
Yeah, so one thing I want to emphasize before I get into the details of the settlement that are on the table, this is a proposed settlement of a class action lawsuit. This is ongoing litigation. Litigation, I want to remind folks that aren't litigators. Litigation is a process that pursues or secures remedies for parties with claims before the court. Litigation can do a lot of good in bringing issues to the forefront, engaging in a process that reveals important facts. I mean, this has been crucial to the history of Title IX, is what we've learned through litigation, and results in remedies that can vindicate important rights. Litigation can serve an important expressive function. I mean, I think Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence in Alston just reverberated throughout the land and really changed perceptions of the NCAA. But no class action lawsuit, no single lawsuit can balance the variety of competing issues involved in our current college sports model. That is what legislatures are set up to do, to balance and weigh all the different issues and agendas and needs and problems, and to sort of weigh them and then set agendas for reform and regulate where necessary and appropriate. So courts can indirectly drive this process and have been indirectly driving this process through their decisions. That's what's accelerating this and bringing this to where we are today. But I think if there's any takeaway from what's happening right now and from this settlement process, and I hate to be a broken record here, Welch, but it's that Congress and state legislatures have a really important role to play, and I hope that they will play it. So to the extent that people are saying we're terrified that everything's going to fall apart with this settlement, I would say, first of all, the settlement's not done yet. And number two, anything that happens in this settlement and fallout, we can seek and should be seeking legislative remedies at both the state and federal levels. So some of the key settlement points in terms of where we are right now, this is in federal court, so federal procedural rules govern, and the court is going to need to find that this settlement is fair, reasonable, and adequate, and we'll hear from a variety of parties about that. The judge has given preliminary approval to this process, to this settlement, but we're still a long way from final approval. Preliminary approval was expected, and it only came after the judge prodded the parties to go back and tweak some things. So I think there can still be a lot more tweaking. So I think there's a hearing set for the spring, where the judge will be looking for and hearing objections to final approval, to hearing all the different viewpoints there. She's pushed back on some of the restraints around NIL, and I'm sure she will have some thoughts at that spring hearing. So we're not there yet, is what I'm trying to say. And it is absolutely not unprecedented that this thing could fall apart. And so I think everybody should feel empowered to make your voice heard in legislatures and in this process. So the settlement itself, as proposed right now and as preliminarily approved, has sort of two main parts to it. The first is what folks have already mentioned, that the NCAA and its member schools will pay about $2.78 billion in damages to a class of current and former players over a 10-year period of time. So that's the money piece. And then the second piece of the settlement is introducing this sort of new framework of a revenue sharing model for college sports. What is being proposed is very much like what we see at the pro sports level as through collective bargaining agreements. But of course, we don't have that because our college athletes are not unionized. So we're having a collective bargaining like situation. So the new framework with revenue sharing, in the first year, entities may provide their athletes with about 22%, I think it is, of the average Power 5 schools revenue, which would be about distributions of about 22 million. Those amounts would increase over the life of the settlement over 10 years as revenue from media rights increase. So payments to athletes can go up. It also, the settlement includes changes to regulation of scholarships, to regulation of third-party NIL deals, to enforcement of this whole new structure. So it envisions an entity that will sort of put some regulation on NIL deals, making sure they're bona fide NIL deals, set up a neutral arbitration system So this will be happening over sort of a 10-year period. What the settlement does not resolve, which I think is as important as what they're hoping to get final approval on, is number one, it only gives 10 years of some potential antitrust protection. It's not blanket categorical antitrust immunity. Folks could still bring, if they opt out, for instance, could bring antitrust lawsuits. Huge questions about how this new enforcement structure would work and could that trigger some litigation. Athletes as employees for purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act, that's an open question. And let me say, that again is a policy question. Congress can change that at any time. And so as things sort of proceed in this settlement, Congress could respond to that. Of course, Title IX issues are still very much an open question. Title IX's been with us and done a fantastic job for over 50 years. We're in a new era. I would say we need to strengthen Title IX, and this is another job for Congress. And the final thing is that's sort of an open question here is, as we sort of mimic pro sports and mimic what pro sports do with collective bargaining agreements through this settlement, if it is finally approved, what we don't have here are what we have at the pro sports level. And it's something that we recommended in our commission report that we think is crucially important for athletes. Whether or not there is unionization, we need entities that are set up to represent athletes' rights with these crucial conversations. And so, for instance, we recommended that there should be an entity for our Olympic and Paralympic athletes and hopefuls, so that there is an entity in this conversation advocating for their rights that could be part of solutions. Right now, we have to rely on athletes going and hiring outside counsel and getting lawyers and getting involved in litigation. That's an inefficient, ineffective process. And so I think a big open question is, when are we going to get serious about entities that are looking out for athletes so that we can bring balance to the whole thing and have balanced conversations about the future of college sports?
And my understanding, sorry, Joe, go ahead.
I just want to just say a few things here, because working with some of the legislators in California and talking about NIL and the 2.9 million is the very thing that right now we're doing is what happens with money is results. So if you're not winning, you're not making money. And a lot of things we're doing is we're supposed to be protecting all the athletes, but this whole conference was Olympic athletes versus perhaps team athletes that get paid. As much as we think it's great in the NIL, and I agree, it's still performance-based, it's still the darling, it's still marketing, it still wins, right? So that 2.9 million, when talking to the legislators, they don't know who to give it to. And in an antitrust, maybe every person who's been a customer might get a piece, whether that's $1 or thousands of dollars. I have been told the only athletes that will be paid are scholarship athletes. What we did, one of the best decisions that potentially was made, is we just reduced the cap of scholarships, allowing all teams to potentially give. Now, maybe someone disagrees with me. The scholarship game has been detrimental to many of these team sports, especially the Olympic sports that were cut because they're funneled more into your team sports. We had sports that had 0 scholarships performing high in their mid-level conferences and still cut because they weren't deemed the results. So there's a lot of pieces going on in some of this legislation. The Dartmouth case, and I just wanted to say, none of them are on scholarship athletes. They're all unionized. They're all on merits. There's just so many different pieces that we're kind of lumping in, but it's really still funneling to the D1 college sports. So I loved how Deanne just said, we need to build in legislation that protects the Olympic sports. If you're going to have a football team, then you must have X, Y, and Z, not just Title IX, not just women versus men or any sort of sex and discrimination, but we're cutting the sports that may not bring us media rights. And that is the problem here that is happening. And it's not just at the sports that I was trying to protect. It's going to be nationwide. And that's why we see the track and field, the swimmings, the rowings. But yet, those were the darlings of the Olympics, the highest medal performing sports. So when we're fighting for all this legislation and all this money and who we're going to pay, it's still only helping a few. And that's the problem. What we have is we have nobody at the legislation level and nobody at the NCAA level kind of looking at this from all tiers, because it's still all about money.
Unfortunately, yeah, that is the way it has turned out. And from my perspective, the moving parts of this settlement, just to kind of build a little bit on what Joey's saying, you've got the back payment of NIL essentially to current and former athletes. And yes, so that is money that they could have made, during that time period for those former athletes. Going forward, it seems like, to Dion's point, the question of whether athletes are employees per se under the Fair Labor Standards Act is open. It's not really addressed, I don't think, by this settlement, but tell me if I'm wrong. But it does call for revenue share with revenue producing athletes is one thing. And the other thing, Joey, you alluded to is another part of the settlement, and I'll be honest, I don't understand why, is the idea of basically getting rid of the idea of equivalency sports. So for most Olympic sports, colleges can spread out a number of scholarships among a much larger number of athletes. So in men's track, I know it's 12.6 grants is the maximum schools, and they can spread that out among however many athletes they want. And getting rid of that and allowing schools to give up to 100% scholarships, I think, in all sports, and having a cap has been discussed on roster sizes and things like that. Have you all heard any conversations about whether those things are going to, if schools seem to be thinking that they are going to be reducing their number of sports to just those that they can support with like 100% scholarships? Is there been any concrete discussions, or is everything still up in the air?
Well, I think this, Walt, is what you'll likely see, and the one main issue that has stood out that probably many on the panel are aware of is Ohio State University, just up the road from me, that probably could afford even more sports than they have. And kudos to them for keeping 30 plus sports with their budget, as opposed to a bigger program like Texas that only has 19, but a larger budget than Ohio State. Their men's gymnastics team is going to be a non-scholarship sport. And I do think that you will see more of that in the future, rather than schools dropping sports, because as Russell so eloquently brought up, and I think a lot of people don't realize, you drop a sport as a school, you lose a lot of revenue, because most of those sports you're dropping, again, way back in the past, a few weeks ago, only 5 sports were full scholarship sports. The rest of those sports, like Russell's and my sport of wrestling, most of them, regardless of how good they are paying something to the institution, some form of tuition. Very few, if any, would get a full scholarship. So I think you might see that. And I know there was a question out there about potentially maybe some sports becoming competitive club perhaps. And I think even that could be a model that we might see. And again, I do think, I know some on the panel may disagree, but I think what Dion said is very eloquent, is that government funding is not government control. There are other models that we can go to where the government certainly isn't controlling it, but they are providing the funding. Because if as a country, and it's replete in the research, we want to have successful teams. We want to be the best in everything. That's American exceptionalism. We want to be the darlings of the Olympics, as Joey said. So we need to protect those sports, but we may have to protect them in a different place. Maybe using the resources that college and universities provide, but that they don't have to be a full-time student. One thing that I wanted to mention on this panel, and it might be unpopular, but I think we have to, before I think we do anything, we have to redefine this educational relationship, rather than have it be a race to the bottom of what I call eligibility standards, but still keeping the pathways open. Why do we have to limit somebody to say you have to be this type of student and you have to graduate in 5 years? Why not provide a lifetime scholarship as part of the compensation? One thing I'm going to propose in my forthcoming book is what I'm calling, I'll probably come up with a better name, Welch, but an athletic GI Bill is what I'm calling it. As somebody who's a veteran, why are we not? We should just be concerned that the athlete at some point in their life, and I think, Joey, it's okay to postpone, because we postpone things all the time. People join the military, we have church missions, whatever. You have a finite time to be an elite athlete. Why not focus on that? You can go to college or do those things anytime. And my proposal is if you play college sports, that you get educational credits. Not that you have to come back to the institution you were at. You don't have to go back to Georgia if you're an athlete there. If you want to go learn a trade, you want to start a business, if you do want to go back to a 4-year school, or if you were able to, as an employee of this institution, or being attached to an athletic club of that institution, and you did get a 4-year degree, you could go and get an advanced degree with this athletic GI Bill that I'm still kind of putting together in concepts. I guess I'd say I have concepts of a plan, no pun intended. But there's many ways that we can do this. We just can't keep doing what we're doing now. And we also can't think that we have to have full-time students at an institution training at an elite level. Now, if they want to do that, I think we can still have that pathway open, but we need to have other pathways and then also reframe the educational paradigm.
Joe,
Yeah.
you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just want to capitalize on club sports really quick. You guys we're all athletes and probably coach athletes. A Division I athlete does not want to be a club athlete. They just don't. And they're not striving to, whether they're striving for performance or scholarship or education, or just that's their life path. Club sports really doesn't have any sort of avenue other than it's just an incredible community builder. And so that should be off the table, at least as the paradigm for Division I, II, and III. But it's an incredible community booster. And it's an incredible way if you've decided not to go D1, II, or III. And so I absolutely support club sports, but it's apples and oranges with Division I athletes. And I don't believe universities can take out a Division I sport and plug in a club and it be the same. They should be having both. And I think both in all levels at that university is what we need to exactly perform the bill suggestion that you were just saying, David. It's a great, more of what should happen. They'd have to be together.
You know, it's really interesting with this conversation. I mean, I am very doomy and gloomy about the future of non-revenue sports, you know, as intercollegiate, as varsity sports, Joey, as you're saying, just because of this scarcity issue that I see the arms race. I only have to look out my window. I'm about 75 yards from Sanford Stadium to see what the arms race looks like and all the millions of dollars that are being hoovered up by football and men's basketball. And so I'm genuinely nervous about the future of sports like skiing, track, wrestling, gymnastics, etc. But you guys are full of ideas and thoughts about processes, policies, ways to move forward. So I guess, do you think I am unreasonably pessimistic about this? And do you think there's room to have these conversations with policymakers, with athletic leaders, that people are open to hearing this? Or is everyone just freaked out about the paradigm shifts that are coming with the settlement, with the enrollment cliff we talked about earlier, with other big picture forces in higher ed and college sports?
I'll let others chime in here real quick, but I just have to say, Walt, is that Dion and Meg said it very clearly. We've said this before about gloom and doom. And as a nation, if we want to be successful in sports, and many younger nations have used sports as nation building, right? We look at Saudi Arabia and Qatar, what they've been doing. If we start losing in those sports, as Joey mentioned, people are going to be up in arms saying, how are we losing? What is happening? And our medal counts are starting to go down per capita when you put us up against some other countries. So I think there's a lot of gloom and doom, but I also think there's other ways and other pathways that we can use to develop those elite athletes. And we need to pursue those and not always look at the colleges and universities being the only way, because I do think your pessimism is well grounded, but also to say that those sports are going to go away and other systems are not going or cannot manifest themselves, I also think is wrong.
And, you know, sorry, go ahead, Russell. Go.
Thanks. No problem. Yeah, so Welsh, to your point, should we have doom and gloom? I think anyone who is an athlete or has been an athlete or has coached athletes knows that in order to have success, you have to have a little bit of healthy delusion, in order to kind of go after something, lofty. I do think what's ahead of us looks pretty bleak. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but I do think with great will and with steadfast kind of commitment, new realities can be imagined. And so I do think that we have to look at these changes as opportunity to see how we can shift. And what that shift looks like, I don't necessarily have the answers. I think that's why we're having these kind of conversations. But I do think that, whether it is, in the current D1 model, whether it's some sort of, enhanced club model. I'm a person who participated in D1 track and field, and so I would rather have that. But I do know there are some club systems. I think of rugby, for instance, that kind of operates in the collegiate space very much so like a D1. They have national championships. They're well funded. They travel. They're pretty much D1. Kind of in the way that they operate. It's just kind of the classification just happens to be club. I think whether we're able to use state legislatures or kind of the federal legislature to see funding opportunities to ensure that these Olympic sports are still invested in. I think it may be a combination of all these approaches may have to be considered in order to ensure that we not only continue to have a really great Olympic output, but that all the innumerable benefits. And I think we kind of lose sight of these things, but sport is a great community builder. It is great for not only the health of the individual. It's great for the ways that it teaches us about ourselves, teaches how to communicate, work collaboratively. Our young people, we need ways for them to be socially engaged, be active in a way that is productive, in a way that actually keeps them from getting into things that can be harmful to them. We should be looking at these sports opportunities as opportunities to kind of invest in our young people, whether they become Olympic champions or whether they just go on to be productive members of society. And I don't think that we think of sport as being important that way. And I just kind of looking at my own personal anecdote. I come from a working class situation in Philly. It wasn't wasn't a terrible neighborhood or anything like that. It was working class people just working hard, trying to make ends meet and doing the best that they can. And on my track team, there were a lot of people who my youth track program, that is, that opportunity to be a part of a team, to travel to different parts of the country every summer. And we weren't from a lot of money, so we would do fundraisers. We would sell like treats. We would not panhandle, but we would have buckets on the side of the road to collect money. We would do fundraisers. We would do skating parties. We would do these things so that everyone could afford to travel to New Orleans, to California, to all these places. We all went to college, and this is inner city, and it was a male-only team in Philadelphia, highly Black and Hispanic. If it wasn't for that opportunity, those kids, the statistics are that we would not have, gone on, and the statistics for what the outcomes, life outcomes would have been far different than what a lot of outcomes ended up being, because we had this great thing through sport to kind of give us other opportunity. And so I don't care if it's track or if it's rugby or if it's skiing, lacrosse, or what have you. I think having these opportunities are really, really important. Just to, I had a separate question for Dion, but I may reserve that because I think Meg wanted to jump in. Yeah, so I'll hold the question I have for Dion after Meg chimes in.
You sure?
All right. Well, I don't want to switch the convo too much. Maybe Dion, you can just hold on to your answer to this, and we can let Meg jump in. I did have some question about was reading with regard to classification of athletes in the collegiate space as employees, concerns around taxation, and whether or not these payments, which I do believe these athletes should receive, whether that will be some sort of burden to them, because I was reading that the payments that they may receive may be kind of almost nullified by kind of what they may have to pay in terms of taxes, and then also the tax exempt status of universities, whether that will kind of make things more interesting or complicated the way depending on how you want to view it. So definitely interested in your thoughts on that, but I do want to give the floor to Meg.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I want to jump in, Welch, too, is, if we just take some of the data at face value, right? We could probably say there might be reason to be pretty pessimistic about things and cutting sports. So for example, some of that data is Power 4 institutions, 26 of the 65 Power 4 institutions generated a net profit in 22. I think that's the most recent data, right? So that means almost 40 did not. There were only 2 group of 5 schools that generated a net profit. So when we're thinking about that from a Division I institution, and that might have been $1, it might have been $20 million. When we put it all together, the latest data from the NCAA says that the net revenue generation of FBS institutions is negative $3.1 million. So when I look at that and I think about, oh gosh, assuming that the House versus the NCAA, everything was approved today, and we move forward with that revenue sharing in 2025, we're definitely going to look at that and say, how in the world are institutions going to make up millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in that gap, right? And the biggest way, the chunkiest way to do that, if we're just looking at budgets as they stand, is to cut teams. That's the chunkiest way to do it. We look at TV media rights, NCAA championship revenue, ticketing, and donors as the top 3 revenue streams for college athletic departments. I think this is where our athletic directors, our college presidents, folks who are at the table with television and media rights groups, you got to push back, right? You can't set these media rights for 10, 15 years when we are in a landscape that is ever changing, and the expectation is now to deliver this revenue share with athletes. There's got to be more give and take in that space. In addition, to Joey's point earlier, the NCAA and folks affiliated need to work with national governing bodies to figure out how to support these athletes from a broader level, whether it's a hybrid model, whether it's thinking about, you know, where to dig from the pool more, because at some point ticket prices are going to be tapped out. I'd love to know how University of Tennessee decided on the 10% talent tax on their tickets, because that's a big ticket raise when we look at it. But also thinking about it from, are donors at some point going to be tapped out, whether they're donating to NIL and collectives versus the athletic department itself. I think there's also going to be some confusion there with donors and boosters to think about, where is my money supposed to go? How is it being used? Is it to bring in top talent? Is it to help build facilities or provide scholarships or new opportunities? So it's really complex in that regard. But I think when we think about our love of sport in the United States and our media and commercialization of sports in the United States, we'll begin to see some shifting there potentially too. But to Russell's point, I don't think it can be understated that the decisions that are being made now at the college level have significant ramifications, not just for the Olympic movement going forward, but also for youth sport and access to youth sport, particularly for different demographics and the impact that that might have as people seek additional education, as they seek additional career opportunities. I don't think it can be understated. And I think it's really important that folks have an understanding that decisions that we're making now for, you know, a few thousand athletes is going to have ramifications for millions.
Sure. Dion, did you want to address that question now? Russell's question?
Sure. Yeah. And, you know, first of all, let me just say, in terms of pessimism, Welch, I think this is a moment of consciousness raising around all sports in the United States, from youth up through the Olympic and Paralympic level. We are 50 years out from Title IX. It has never been fully enforced. We need to dig deep and go back to the drawing board and press our legislators to update that. We know from, again, Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence in Alston and from congressional investigations that we have a college sport model that is making money off the backs of athletes, and that amateurism is really just a labor relations tool and not really a model at all. And we're raising consciousness around the Olympic and Paralympic movement around issues of abuse. Safe Sport has a lot that needs to be fixed. And so we're learning a lot about sports that are some really uncomfortable truths. I'm optimistic because I believe, as a law teacher and a lawyer, that law can go a long way to solving a lot of these problems. But what we don't want to do is rely on private regulation and litigation settlements to dictate what our sports agenda in the United States should be. We are all stakeholders in a soup to nuts youth sport, all the way up to elite sports development agenda. We are all stakeholders, and we need to get in front of our legislators at the state and at federal level and ask for the types of systems that we want, because there is ample authority to do that. And I'll just quickly say, I've been doing that here in Maryland. Some of you may know about Jordan McNair, a University of Maryland football player who needlessly died of heat stroke. And I've been working with his father to advocate at the state level. What's very interesting to me is when we have met with Maryland legislators, they have said over and over to me, are we allowed to pass laws regulating? Doesn't the NCAA do that? Don't we have to stay out of it? The NCAA is a private membership association. So I think we have a lot of consciousness raising to do with our legislators as well. As far as Russell's question goes to tax, Russell, I'm going to tell you, my tax teacher in law school and the tax people at my law firm when I was practicing law said, unless you're a tax person, never answer a tax question. But I'm going to answer it because I have an essay coming out in the Fordham Law Review, and my co-author and I looked at the tax argument, and we conclude, and we believe this very strongly, this is a red herring. This is a scare tactic by the NCAA. First of all, the NCAA has had what tax experts call a sweetheart deal under tax law for a very, very long time. Scholarships don't necessarily have to be taxed. This is something that we believe is more scare campaign than real. And even if the IRS determined, yes, we're going to go forward and start taxing scholarships because existing law requires that. Even if that happened, it's a very quick policy change to decide that they are not going to do that. So we conclude in the essay that there's very little to this except throwing a lot of spaghetti against the wall to sort of scare people off of this. And I think it should be part of our advocacy efforts as well as we ask for solutions to say, of course, athletes shouldn't have increased tax burdens because schools have not had these increased tax burdens, and the NCAA and its member institutions have had a what people call a sweetheart deal for a very long time.
Absolutely. There are 8 million components that I would really love to talk to you about, but I do want to get to our audience questions because we're running a little bit short on time. So I'm going to go first with Bruce Smith's question, which is how can Olympic sports leverage the NIL era and these coming changes to help make Team USA better relative to international competition? Any of y'all want to tackle that?
Well, I might want to defer to Joey on that one, but I'll just say, real quick that, again, we see the commercials of Home Depot, athletes working for Home Depot to help fund themselves, because we are, again, like we have some strange things that go on in this country. We have the educationally based system that basically is our main sport development system, but we also have a privately funded Olympic Committee, right? Which is different from most of the other countries in the world. So our athletes in many sports, I know certainly probably in Joey's sports, have to go out and make their own money somehow. And so NILs could be a way. We look at Jeremy Bloom probably being the most famous example of one who was able to make significant NIL money as a model, but yet the NCAA would not let him play football, even though he was also an Olympic skier, and that's what he was doing his fundraising for. So I see it as a great opportunity personally for the athletes to be able to enhance their own brand, but also fund their Olympic development finances.
Absolutely. I'm going to echo on that. We had in the NCAA ruling with our national, we would give out funding if they won a medal, and you would get paid to win that medal. Those college athletes had to give that money back. We have actually come a little bit further in the last couple of years that they can accept it. For a while, there was a transition where they had to use it for travel and show a receipt to accept it. So where I think, and I want to compliment with Dion, we have so far to go. I don't think anything's doom and gloom because I'm going to just remind everyone what Russell's saying. The more we can keep kids in sports, but have a dream, you can't just say join a club. If there's no end result, whether it's NCAA, whether it's a gold medal, whether it's a trip, whether it's college, whether it's to go to Las Vegas for a soccer tournament, if we don't keep working with youth and giving them the end goal, none of this is going to happen. And the way we solve it isn't just legislation, but we have to put pressure on the NCAA. We need to actually tier this. We cannot have basketball and football in the same tier as Olympic sports. Someone, whether it's legislatures, all of us, needs to design some rules and some pathways that are tiered, because what's happening is schools just have to follow their football or their conference. And I don't think we've answered any of that. And I think we all agree that most importantly is, I love Ohio State with 30 sports. The more you can keep practicing in sports, the more community leaders you're going to have, the more successful athletes, the less depression, the less suicide, the more gold medals. There's way more, but what we're doing, as we always do, is we follow the money first. And then that sometimes puts the wrong precedent. So to go back to that question about Olympics, when we started taking away these barriers that the NCAA put on our Olympians, we are collaborating now. Those Olympic athletes who wanted to do national goals can now go to college, which is important to be able to do, whether you start college at 20, 26, 30, that's up to the athlete to decide. And it's up to us to be able to provide those stair steps for that athlete, because every athletic career is a different age. It's a different goal. But we are starting to still hamstrung this with rules. And at the end result, the parent body has to make money too. So now the athletes are making money, and the admins are making money, and the athletic directors need wins, and the colleges still need to make money, and the NCAA needs to make money, and the media needs to make money. Should people make money? Yes, but that is absolutely how the United States differs from socialism and all of the other countries that manage their sports, which I'm not saying we need to, it's a beautiful thing. But how do we work more together versus have all these different entities popping up, controlling a piece for money? And that's the end result of what's happening. And we've seen that in the Olympic movement, and we've seen that in the NCAA movement. And I do think if we fix that, it's going to be better for the athlete.
Yeah, I think that brings up like what Meg said with centralized control, but I do like your tiering aspect. You know, another thing we've talked about, I know Donna Lopiano was listening, but when she directed the AIAW, their sports, they could choose what level that they wanted to play at, and schools could. Like, for instance, say Ohio University, we're never going to be Ohio State in football, but we could be very nationally competitive in 4 or 5 sports. Why not let a school choose? We're going to have these 5 sports at Division I, these 7 sports at Division II, 10 sports at Division III, and then we'll have an enhanced club model for dozens of other sports. There's so many ways to do it, but to sit there and say to be a Division I member, you have to sponsor 16 sports is an artificial barrier. I think, let the schools choose and decide sport by sport what level they can compete at. You can be nationally competitive at virtually any school in some sport, right? I think that's been proven years and years. But to sit here and say have an Ohio University with an Ohio State in this Division I box for football and other sports, for me, is ludicrous.
Turn to a question from Betsy Mitchell, who says, as a collegiate AD, former coach, Division I athlete, Olympian, can the panel address why we feel it necessary to prepare foreign national team members? And the way she frames is at the expense of U.S. athletes. And I wonder if any of y'all want to tackle that or sort of address whether you think that is being done at the expense of U.S. athletes.
Yeah, I hate to bring this up but I have to preface this, Walsh, that I am married to a foreign national. My kids are dual citizens of a European country, Germany. But yes, to me, again, other sport development systems around the world are not training U.S. athletes. And having foreign athletes train in our main system, right? And I understand that coaches have to win. They want to bring in the best athletes, but having foreign athletes train in our main sport development system is taking away opportunities. Now, people have joked with me and said they've called me the Donald Trump of college athletics. I do not want to ban foreign athletes from our campuses. Believe me, I don't. But I do think that this is another argument for us to have alternative pathways, because I do believe, and again, I don't have the exact data to back this up, but I look at, there are some teams on our campuses that you can find that it's very difficult to find an American-born athlete in certain sports, women's and men's tennis, for example. And again, not being xenophobic in any way, but I think we have to look at to say, for that to trickle down, for those opportunities, those dreams that Joey talks about. And I understand these foreign athletes being great stuff to our campuses, great competition, helps us rise to a certain level. But we also need to have those other pathways for American athletes so they can develop, so they can dream, so that some opportunities in some sports are not minimized for them. Should our colleges and universities have that responsibility? They really shouldn't, but I think that toothpaste is out of the tube, so to speak. So I think the better approach is to do something different to make sure that our American-born athletes have those pathways so they can also dream and succeed in those sports.
Joey, I'm assuming that a lot of NCAA ski teams import some of their talent from
Absolutely. To
overseas.
capitalize on that question, we actually found that in the 80s and 90s, it was primarily foreign. And I'm going to say some of my very best friends and our business leaders in the US have come from other countries. So I don't want to exclude them in the collegiate system. It's still a capitalistic pay. And that is the pay to play. But it was results oriented, right? We were bringing in the best athletes. So what we did as a nation is actually prepared our US athletes to compete for those spots as well. It wasn't put a cap on, and bringing in Americans versus foreign. It was bring our level up for that sport, which we have risen. If we've got gold medals now in Nordic, where before we might have barely cracked the top 20. So is that an issue? It is. And do we sit here going, that should go to our US athlete? Because we are still global and the Olympics are global, we've benefited from having athletes come in and train and show us their ways. I would rather see us help our US athletes compete for those spots than eliminate those spots. And we work literally primarily 90% at some colleges, if not 100. Now it might be 50-50, or it might even be 70-30. And those coaches did work to help that. And so did those universities. But we always remember, you got to win. And who are you going to win with? The best athlete.
I'm sorry, I'm moving quickly here because we're running out of time, but John Neighbor asks, in the light of NIL and anticipated changes in the college sports space, what responsibility should USOPC have to maintain US success? Basically, should the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee and its resources have some skin in the game when it comes to talent development at the college level? What do you all think?
Well, I'll just first say, wow, John Neighbor, I'm a big fan, but I'll let somebody else answer the question.
I think our commission made some recommendations around changes that we thought could be beneficial on making the USOPC, for instance, really in charge of elite athletic development, splitting off their supposed mandate that they've really mostly ignored to develop grassroots and grassroots sports pipeline. And so we have a whole range of recommendations around that, including athlete empowerment. We believe that empowered athletes, at least our commission endorsed, can be more successful athletes. And we also have recommendations around the fact that the USOPC has some very valuable Olympic marks, and they should use those more in service of athlete development and less in service of, for instance, executive compensation. So I encourage folks who are interested in that to go and read the report.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank everyone for participating. I apologize to our participants whose questions we didn't get to. But I would encourage all of y'all to look at all of the stuff that's out there that all these people on this panel have published and put out about ideas for improving college sports and maximizing the opportunity for athletes. I'd also like to thank Becca and Julie of the Drake Group and Donna Lopiano for their work in setting this discussion up. You all will get your recap notes by email, as Becca mentioned. So enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I hope you will get out and watch a college game of some sort this weekend. I'm going to go to UGA soccer myself. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to the next Drake Group conversation.